Okay, well, hello and welcome everyone. This is, as usual, the UCCS speaker series. I'm Richard Kravitz, the director at UCCS, and I'd like to welcome all of you. We have a nice sized crowd today. Today's talk is a continuation of our series on the future of publicly funded education. And we selected this theme in association with our board of advisors and faculty council because we recognize the role education plays in preparing young people for the future and in promoting equity by serving as a kind of social escalator. And yet many times education in America fails. It fails in particular for many young people in our large cities and in the urban core, some of whom repeatedly bump up against a system that's rigid in its expectations and sometimes harsh in its consequences. Here to expand on these themes and share data about an intervention to make things better are Victor Rios and Trevor Aldridge Reveles. Dr. Rios is Associate Dean of Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology at UC Santa Barbara. He's the author of 5 books, including most recently, My Teacher Believes in Me, The Educator's Guide to At-Promise Students. Professor Rios has led a research program aimed at improving the quality of interaction between youth and authority figures. And as you can read in his bio, he's uniquely qualified to take on this challenge, having not only risen to a high academic rank, but also having significant street cred. So Dr. Rios is joined by Trevor Aldridge Reveles, who's a PhD student in sociology at UC Santa Barbara. He's already authored several peer-review articles, including one entitled, I Was Pushed Out of School, Social and Emotional Approaches to a Youth Promotion Program, which I think links to our topic today. So during the program, Dr. Rios will speak first, followed by Mr. Aldridge Reveles, and then both will engage in a brief discussion before we take questions. And as usual, the best way to ask a question is to use the raise hand feature in the participants tab in Zoom. So without anything further, let's turn it over to Dr. Rios.
Thank you, Dr. Kravitz. Hello, everyone. So honored to be here. We're just going to get right to it because we're short on time. Always wish we had more time. So we're going to present a combination of empirical data and then just kind of insight from over 10 years of collecting this data in communities such as Oakland, California, Watson, LA, and other parts of Southern California. So we want to present you with just little bits of the data, not trying to convince you that we have all of this data and just give you 50 minutes of data, because that would be a research conference presentation, but instead just give you tidbits of the data and then go into our insights in terms of what we've learned over those 10 years of collecting this data, and then conclude with some possible policy implications that can launch a conversation. So to begin, I like to talk about inequality in our education system as being loosely coupled. And this insight came to me when I was doing a 2-year ethnography inside a school. I'd been following kids on the streets for my first book, Punished, Policing the Lives of Black and Latino Boys. That's one of the first books that systematically looks at the school to prison pipeline. For that book, I followed these boys, some of these boys, for 3 years, and you see some of them pictured here on the street alley there. And these young men, for 3 years, I watched them grow up and realized that school safety and school discipline really meant for them, really meant the entryway into the school to prison pipeline, direct connections to encounters with police and then getting locked up. And you follow them for those 3 years, and you get these narratives, these life stories of, you unfortunately you go visit some of them in prison 3, 5, 7 years later, and you ask them, why are you here? Let's go back, because I have my notes as to when you got in trouble. Why are you here? And they can't figure it out. It's not like they, became drug kingpins. It's not like they stabbed someone. It's not like they were violent criminals. And you see that the buildup to them being in prison is violating probation, is getting high on a street corner, is getting into conflict with an officer, not a physical altercation, just, just, you know, demanding their rights, and an officer pretty much saying, you're going in now. And if you go back, you realize that most of these young people getting caught up in the system never had one violent offense, but more than anything, just re-offending every time in a nonviolent way. Number one is violating probation. So I'll get into that towards the end of the conversation as well. So an equity and justice framework is important, we believe, in developing policy, because if we don't name that there is racism in our practices in schools and in law enforcement and in criminal justice in the state of California, we don't name it and bring out the data to show it, and we're trying to be colorblind about our policy, we're not going to get far. We're going to continue to perpetuate the inequality. So in terms of a research question, more generally, how does school safety and harsh discipline impact equity, school climate, and teacher-student relationships? And what can we do differently, right? Because some of you on this call already know there's a problem. Some of you know the data. Some of you are the data collectors. Some of you have had people look at data for you. Some of you have produced policy recommendations based on this data. So what can be done differently? So some of the data we're relying on here is interview, ethnography, and survey study at a local high school. We surveyed all of the students, all of the teachers, interviewed many students, interviewed many teachers, and it was a racially diverse school. One of the frameworks we're utilizing is this idea of safe schools as conflict schools. In other words, the more that you implement safety mechanisms, such as school resource officers, zero tolerance policies, um, drug dogs, security fences, the more likely you're going to create conflict between students, among students, and between students and educators and administrators. Here's some quotes as examples. My English teacher has my referrals already written for me, a big stack. He waits just for me to say something, and he'll be like, all right, go outside and walk to the office. And I know because they always say the same, like, no matter what I do, it says disruptive in class. By the way, we're also pushing these studies into remote learning. Same kids that used to get in trouble quarantine are the same kids getting in trouble during quarantine. And what's going on with them is that they're just being zoomed out, not zoomed out like us, like, Zoom fatigue, zoomed out, like meaning pushed out of school by being banned from joining class anymore on this platform. And that's kind of how where discipline has gotten even harsher, because at least before you might be sent to the office and come back. Now it's like you just can't get on screen anymore, so you have no access anymore. We're starting to see that as a big trend for at promise students across the state in terms of just going in and doing some parachute interviews at various sites. What happens to kids that get in trouble? They just get disappeared from remote learning. They feel like white kids are like better, like Mexican kids are crime related, and I think they think they're like bad influences, and they think we're like not smart. They think that like white kids are smart and they're like good kids, good influences. Here's a student talking about teachers. The teacher called on me, chose me, and the white guy, the fellow student, he said, "Oh, he won't know the answer. He's Mexican." The teacher didn't say anything. So no protecting against. In this case, it's not even a microaggression; it's an actual racial aggression. So there's no protection there against these aggressions. I just skip school, go to a friend's house, help my parents with work, do drugs, just anything rather than school. I hate school. Sometimes we maybe as a society will stereotype a culture and say, well, these people don't, their culture doesn't value it, or poor people don't value education. But we're starting to see more and more that actually a lot of working class families value education. But when the kids actually show up to school, they're being criminalized, they're not being protected in terms of racial attacks, both symbolic and physical, and they're just being excluded. And the kids end up deciding school, in terms of me rationalizing what's good for me right now, school's not for me. Teachers have this idea at this school anyway, that like Mexicans don't care about school. They, are going to have babies, they're going to go to jail, and the whites are kids that, AP classes, they're going to go to like Stanford. So the kids clearly see the unequal treatment at the same school site. And this is why I call it a loosely coupled system, because there's some institutions out there, schools and law enforcement are some of those institutions that are loosely coupled. So meaning that the practices, no matter what policies you push from the top down, once you close the classroom door, or once you could close the patrol car door, you have a lot of leeway in terms of how you can engage your practice on a day-to-day basis. So in other words, one classroom next door to you can be enlightening, could be doing incredible work, transformative for students, sending them off to Stanford. And the other classroom right next door to you, there could be punishment, school to prison pipeline setup, and discrimination. And that's what we mean by loose coupling. You don't know which one. We're all in silos. There's no consistency in best practices in schools at the moment. The sorry. The most at-risk cluster of students, this is from a teacher, is the Latino boy. Well, I would say crime influences them sometimes before they go to high school or after their first year. So these assessment of students as a criminal class, of Latino boys in this case. It happens in other schools we've studied with African American boys as well. Latino students don't really care about learning, and you can't force motivation. That's the cultural stereotype there. School is just not a priority in their home. Again, family stereotype. Many Latino students relish the role of being academic dropouts. The only way I can control them is by texting the school resource officer. So some of you are very aware that, in the last 30 years in California, there was this massive increase of school resource officers roaming around in hallways. And what you saw across the board was that more resource officers meant more conflict with at promise students, with the ones getting in trouble. And so you see in this case a collaboration between teachers and school officers where it went beyond committing a crime. These kids were just arguing with the teacher, and the teacher would text the officer would come in and drag the kid out of class to teach him a lesson. I feel safer when I have a security guard in my class. So for some teachers, securitizing the classroom, meaning security guards and officers, is the solution to dealing with rowdy kids. Um, and this is because there's a big fear of males of color in particular. We even assessed how teachers react when boys of color walk in. Some great teachers that are teaching honors classes, right? When there's less boys of color in the classroom, they will kind of lecture like this and open up their body language and talk to kids in these kinds of ways. When the boys of color walk in, they actually go sit down and cross their arms and avoid even eye contact. It's a clear sign of fear of these young men. And the young men are the ones that pointed it out to us to begin with. They said, my teacher's just scared of me. And then there's direct racism. These are CDs that a teacher gave white kids extra credit for bringing for Bugga Thug music. He would play on his boombox Bugga Thug music to bug the thugs away, which were the Mexican kids Mexican American kids that hung out in front of his classroom. He didn't like them. He didn't want them hanging out during passing hour. So he told the white kids, go record CDs with just music that will annoy them. And so he called it Bug a Thug music. The white kids are the ones that turned these CDs into me and said, look, Dr. Rios, this is what my teacher is forcing me to do. And I get extra credit for it. So I end up doing it. They felt coerced to do it. Now I want to show you some images of in the same school. Talk about the loosely coupled inequality. In the same school, you have AP and honors courses. These are the, of course, you end up in college if you take these courses. And they look pretty average, right? You have in this science course, you have, strands of DNA. You have AP and honors courses. This is what we call informational support, lots of information for students in the classroom. That's always good. You have a class where the teacher worked on a mural, very colorful class, a cool class. These are all the honor students. Now we're going into the low achieving students, what they call college prep classes. And you see the walls are bare, dirty classrooms, disorganized classrooms. It kind of resembles our society, middle class communities, looking nice, pretty, kept up, lots of order, low income communities not being invested in, not looking so sharp. And this is institutionalized in the same school environment. And there's also kids just not feeling comfortable in class, teachers posting up stuff about immigrants being chased by zombies, Nazis. And the kids are like, this teacher's racist. And the teacher says, no, I'm just teaching them about freedom of speech. Okay, so let's talk about change. How do we change these racist systems? Let's just, based on the data, both global quantitative data and then very local qualitative data and the combination of both, we find that these practices in schools are rampant and that these practices need to be named what they are, racist practices. How do we implement a transformative system that changes not just individuals, like, oh, you're a bad kid, let's give you some restorative justice and then you'll be a good kid. That's too simplistic. It's like, no, let's transform the culture of the institution so that kids start to feel that they're welcomed and embraced. So now, Trevor, you could talk a little bit about some of the work we've done in terms of the transformative justice piece.
Perfect. Appreciate it, Dr. Rios. Can folks hear me okay? Okay, nice. Yeah, so, as Dr. Rios said, this really begs a big question, right? Which is, what might educational programs look like that focus on promoting students, right, rather than punishing them? And so I'm going to talk a little about promotion and what that means. So what is promotion, right? So for us, it's this idea of being an organizational counterpart to the idea of an individual at promise student, right? So a lot of the language that educational programs use to describe themselves actually mimics the same deficit language that the term at promise seeks to remedy. So for example, many programs call themselves prevention programs or intervention programs. But we need to make sure that our language about individual students, right, also matches our expectations for them, and that our language and expectations is the same as what we have for those individual students, right? So because of this, we call programs that work with at promise students youth promotion programs instead of prevention or intervention. So this language is actually really common in public health, but also needs to be common in educational environments and educational policymaking. Next slide. Yeah, so what does youth promotion look like? So the goal of this study was to analyze the effects of Project GRIT, a 6-week youth promotion program in Watts that worked with a group of 39 former high school pushouts. So those are students who were told by school officials to leave a school district in Southern California. Project GRIT originated from the idea that we must reframe the terming of youth from at risk to at promise, and also to create programs that reflect this framing. So Dr. Rios and Rios led a team of former students and colleagues to help youth improve well-being in mind, body, and soul. And the model sought to give each youth dignity, resiliency, respect, and at a really basic level to treat them as human beings with the potential to succeed in school and the workforce. So they facilitate a wide range of activities, motivational presentations, college tours, self-reflection activities, team building activities, historical presentations on the Watts community, and so on and so forth. And this research sought to understand the lived experiences of these students who were pushed out of high school and to understand the impact of promotion that focused on their social and emotional well-being. So some of the main outcomes from this project were communication, relationship development, teamwork, recognizing shared community worth and struggle, as well as building trust and self-confidence. You can go to the next slide, please. So students joined the program because they were excited about building relationships with other people. So Ernesto explains this nicely. The continuation school told me it wasn't only going to be writing or reading books. It's going to be more of a program where we would all communicate with each other, right? We'd all communicate with each other and get to know and see our lives and how our lives fit together. So this is really important because many of these young people were told at some point in their educational experiences to not, quote, talk back to school officials. And so we might be able to understand like why a school official might say this, but what it literally tells a student is to not communicate. You cannot physically dialogue with young people if you tell them not to talk to you, right? So in this program, students like Ernesto came to see themselves as skilled oral communicators, right? Flipping this idea of talking back in a way that they could use skills as oral communicators to build relationships with other people. So they develop these relationships through teams and teamwork. So as Jesse put it, they're teaching teamwork to change the way the system works, to change our communities. Because if I go by myself and I try to change it, it's not just going to happen. But if I go with every single student, that's a different story. Students felt they're able to develop a sense of collaboration. So apart from relationship building, some students also reflected on something that drew them to the project and that they learned throughout the course of the program: the collective struggle to change society. Most had actually never been part of organized groups before, and so the program kind of provided an avenue to work on projects together. So they realized that shared struggle could create opportunities to care and be cared for, to develop a sense of pride and confidence in themselves and their community. This turned feelings of isolation to feelings of connection. So this was also closely connected to recognition of shared community worth. As Valerie said, in these instances, or as Valerie said, what I learned is not only going to help me, but everybody. It's going to help me be even more confident, be more proud, and say, hey, this is where I'm from. I didn't choose it, but it don't make me a bad person. So these students came to see a shared community worth as one of their strengths. This recognition of struggle, people's capacity to value their community, was a framework to facilitate the pursuit of both individual and collective goals. It was an impetus to develop relationships, because many times they felt they couldn't develop healthy relationships with other people. And shared community worth gave way to recognition of shared community stories and struggle. So every workshop day actually included an autobiographical story from one of the facilitators, and the youth connected with them and seeing how they pushed through struggle. At times, it just meant that students could see people were exercising agency in their lives. At other times, these were moments where these stories motivated students to discuss wanting to go back to school. Right? So as Dorinda said, their stories are like our stories, like some of what they have lived, we've lived it. For some reason, when you connect stories, you don't feel like strangers anymore. So it's like, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to try it. So that's an image of one of the facilitators in the program, Ana Medrano. And so she was actually from the neighborhood that they did this programming in. So students also often talked about the importance of trust and confidence in the context of relationship building. So whether that was for other people or themselves. And in one instance, a young person reflected on how they came to understand boundaries and the importance of maintaining these types of boundaries. So Karen said, I've learned what kind of people to trust, where I should put my walls down, and what places I should put them up. So this was particularly important for her because she was able to recognize that there's a nuance in trust, right? It might be equally harmful to trust every person just as it is to distrust every person. So she exercised her agency through these walls, deciding with whom she could share intimate details and relationships and for whom she couldn't. And many of the comments also focused on self-confidence. One student specifically noted how closely the notions of trust and confidence were linked. She felt she could trust project facilitators, so she came to believe that she was capable and was able to accomplish what she wished for in life. And so in her case, she came to realize things are already true about herself, and she came to see herself as that promise. I finally realized I am a successful woman. I am powerful. I'm just going to keep it real to the fullest. So why is promotion in these types of programs important? Because at-promise students need environments that promote them. At-promise students need environments that promote them. And so some people might be familiar with this language of promotion and kind of its connection to graduation and moving between grades. But promotion and celebration, right? These ideas need to be part of every single day that a child is in a school in California. The examples that Dr. Rios pointed out from the first study, I think highlighted really effectively what it looks like for students to feel alienated. My English teacher already has my referrals written for me. And so promotion can create spaces where students don't feel alienated, but enchanted, right? This can help us point to directions where perhaps we don't focus on how inequality reproduces itself, but really creating a rigorous body of evidence of how equity might regenerate itself. Awesome. So where do you all, the policy community, come in, as well as the folks that I know are doing the UCCS student programs too? So we recommend implementing restorative justice practices in all public schools. And one thing that's actually really important to know is if you talk to any seasoned trainer in restorative justice, they're going to tell you the first part about restorative justice is about building relationships and enchanting school communities. Right? Restore is the first part of the word, right? Or the first part of the phrase, restore and then justice. They want to restore and build relationships. That's how you can get to a point where you might even be able to imagine justice, right? Just as Brian Stevenson talks about truth and reconciliation, truth comes first, right? And so in restorative justice framework, restoration, relationships need to come first. So different examples of trainers, of folks that do this type of work throughout the state included the SEEDS Community Resolution Center in Berkeley, Flourishing in Oakland, the California Conference for Equality and Justice in Long Beach, and Joven Noble in San Jose. And so I think secondly, we need a robust infrastructure of what a lot of people call grow your own programs. And those are programs that actually recruit students to become educators while they're in high school. And so there are education programs in California that do this already, but higher education programs aren't always connected to work done in districts and vice versa. And unfortunately, these programs also often, let me turn this off. So these programs also often recruit the highest academically performing students, right? And are not necessarily inclusive of all at-promise students. So one model of this is the Call Me Mr. program, which is widely considered the most effective model of this in the nation. And they try to create educators that Alfred Tatum calls soul models. So these programs require partnerships between universities, districts, to both recruit students into teaching, but also to sustain them financially and emotionally in school, right? And through teacher preparation programs that teach them how to do culturally responsive teaching. Pass it off to you, Victor. Dr. Rios.
Yeah, so thank you, Trevor. So as you can see, we're just giving you a little bit of the data and I think really trying to understand how do we turn this data into actionable items. And so one very practical, actionable item to start to talk about and move pretty quickly on is that everyone right now, right? The big conversation out there is the reopening, right? It's everywhere. And not just the reopening, but also mandated to our educators is, hey, we've had a learning loss. We need a quick learning recovery. And that, in our perspective, is a deficit approach to take on. because in reality, our children in California have not, right, undergone a learning loss, right? They're not losing anything. What's happened is that they are surviving a pandemic, right? And until we think about it in a way where things, unfortunately, in the developmental stage of our children in California, were swapped around, right? Uh, it's going to be tough for you to catch up and stay up on your academics, but go ahead and just survive this pandemic with your parents as essential workers, with you losing family members, with your whole community uh, uh, in a vulnerable state. Did you survive? Yes, I survived. What lessons did you learn in that survival? So rather than think of it as a learning loss, we have to think of it as an emotional gain. And so in the care opening, is what we're calling it, right? Those first 6 weeks of opening school, we might rush to try to catch up our kids on academics, but that might throw things off. We've been playing with some models in terms of human behavior when you put them back in environments they've been away for a while. And we've found that there's a lot of conflict that takes place when you put humans back in environments they were once used to um, navigating in. So you need some time to re-socialize everyone, the students, parents, administrators, and teachers. And the best way to re-socialize people to go back into an academic institution is to provide care, well-being, embrace, social emotional learning, and restorative practices or transformative practices. Right? That these individuals coming back are going to need a lot of care and embrace. And if we're like, hey, welcome back, we're going to teach you 20 lessons on math in the first 6 weeks, that might backfire on us. Instead, we should figure out ways to implement policies and programs that are all about making sure that students can um, get a grounded self of emotional well-being before even starting their academic endeavor. Also, because we went in reverse from the streets and studying law enforcement and criminal justice institutions, we went backwards and then went into school to find out how these kids were being pushed out. We're always going to propose um, a combination of policies and programs that work in tandem with police and law enforcement practices. Um, and so for us, LA County has done a great thing in the last couple of years where now they've mandated pre-charge diversion programs before booking and fingerprinting. That's huge. Like, okay, let's say a kid gets kicked out of school. Even right now, they're zoomed out. They want to be on the streets. And a lot of kids are still on the streets, gathering in groups, no masks during the pandemic. And the police shows up, right? And the kids getting, like you saw in one of the pictures, kids holding a bottle of liquor. And boom, underage, you're getting a citation. I'm bringing you in. You're going to court. He goes to court. He's 14. And the judge says, oh, no big deal. It's your first offense. Here, we'll give you probation. Well, when you're on probation, you lose many of your rights and it pipeline you deeper and deeper into the system. So instead, what we should do across California is mandate that for all these nonviolent offenses, right, small time offenses, that we divert these kids somewhere. Nonprofits are doing a great job providing these resources, but we should provide resources to schools to engage in diversion programs within the school. Let me tell you why. Because nowadays, when kids are getting in trouble in school, the only resources we have is to forward them over to the school resource officer. And the school resource officer, the only resource they have nowadays is to pipeline those kids into the criminal justice system. Oh, you're not going to listen to me? I'm going to cite you. Oh, you don't care about citations? Now I'm gonna handcuff you. Oh, you don't care about handcuffs? Now I'm gonna arrest you. Oh, you don't care about arrest? I'm gonna send you to court so they put you on probation. Oh, you don't care about probation? Now I'm gonna arrest you for violating probation, and now you're going to boot camp. Now you're going to. So this is how that school to prison pipeline gets perpetuated, and it's racialized, right? The majority of kids that go through this school to prison pipeline are children of color, including increasingly in the last decade, girls of color as well. So diversion programs embedded inside of school are important, right? That you have not security guards, but success coaches. Right? Now, you might say, well, we need school safety. Absolutely. Success coaches can be there to provide that school safety, right? Your security guard shows up to your school and you say to them as an administrator, oh, you're no longer a security guard. Oh, am I fired? No, you're not fired. You've been upgraded. You leveled up. Now we're going to train you in being a success coach. Oh, what does that mean? That means that instead of just referring the kid out to law enforcement, you're actually now going to implement conflict resolution, self-awareness, reflection time for them so that they can make amends for the mistake they made and so they could repair the situation so they can learn from their mistakes. And then finally, this has been happening in some jurisdictions. It's a big conversation, but a statewide law would be great where school resource officers are actually not roaming the hallways and plucking kids out of classes because they're being defiant to their teachers. Of course, a violent threat is important to address, and that's a separate conversation. But to have resource officers embedded in the school, in some of our interviews with kids, they're very anxious around school resource officers. They don't feel comfortable. And in addition, any negative interaction that's interpersonal that could be dealt with it within the school site could potentially become a law enforcement criminal justice intervention that then almost forces officers to drag kids into the system. So having officers, right? And the debate can be, um, can be had about how far away should officers be? Is it outside of the school? Is it in a certain part of the school? Is it there to support the school? How do you support them? But walking those hallways and popping into classrooms is definitely a process that we have found and other studies have found is disruptive to vulnerable populations in terms of their ability to learn and to thrive in a school environment. So we're going to leave it there and make sure we leave enough time for questions. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Rios and Mr. Aldridge, for your talk today. This is fantastic. And so we are going to go ahead and open it up to Q&A, but first I'm going to give Brooke a chance to go ahead and stop the recording.